This video is going to absolutely be about Jaquish. I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but that's the way I'm going to say it. I had never heard of this guy. I didn't know he had been around as a controversial figure for apparently several years. I just was totally randomly browsing YouTube and I came across this TED Talk that was being recommended. And it was titled something like, "Weightlifting is a waste of time." So immediately they got my attention. And my first reaction was like, well, I'm not going to watch that. The guy's an idiot. But then I thought, well, I should be open-minded. If something that's this clickbait kind of controversial is being featured in a TED Talk and it's got this many views, maybe despite the fact that it's got this, this very catchy, controversial title, there's actually something of substance in it. So I'll watch it and take a look. And I watched the video, and within the first few minutes, I had problems with what he was saying, but again, open-minded, I'll watch the whole thing. And at the end, my conclusion was the guy's a charlatan. Then a couple days later, a channel that I'm familiar with, Sliding Bench Trainer, he did an interview with this guy. And I sat through the entire interview, which was over an hour. And after that, I was actually convinced, yeah, this guy's a charlatan. He's a snake oil salesman. This is not an accident. He is very intentionally, very methodically going out of his way to mislead people for the sake of marketing a product that he's selling. In this interview with Sliding Bench Trainer, the very first thing that came up was the controversy surrounding if his PhD is legitimate or not. I had never heard this. Again, I have no history with the guy. I've never read about him or anything prior to this. But the fact that the first thing that came up was apparently there's some controversy around whether he has a legitimate doctorate's degree or not, made me think, okay, well, what's this about? If it's widespread enough and it's common enough to mention this, and it's attached to his reputation so much that it's the very first thing that comes up in an interview, I should probably look into this. And apparently there is some problems with this because, all right, so according to he himself, not somebody trying to discredit him, he got his PhD from Rushmore University. And in this interview with Sliding Bench Trainer, he claimed that the criticism is in regards to the legitimacy of his degree. And it was started by internet trolls. That's another red flag, because immediately when somebody just dismisses something as, oh, internet trolls, no need to look here, those are just trolls, move along. That, again, makes you want to dig and say, well, just because somebody's criticizing you doesn't mean they're a troll. Here's how it is. As far as his education goes, it's kind of hard to find anything about his education that's not being stated by he himself. He seems to have the market cornered for Google when it comes to what happens when you type his name into the Google search results. You type his name into Google, almost everything that comes up, he has his hand in somehow. It's like a self-promotion sort of thing. So having to be very diligent in where I looked and what I read and what I checked and how I cross-referenced things, I came up with this kind of information. He wasn't studying medical anything. In the 90s, when he went to school in California, he was studying marketing, wanted to get his bachelor's with a focus on marketing. Then later with the University of Phoenix, which is immediately a step down. As a side note, these are the kind of things that when you're investigating somebody seems suspicious. Why would you go from a legitimate, respected university like California State University, which though it's a public university, it's well known, it's been around for like 150 plus years. But then you step down to something like the University of Phoenix, which is notoriously suspect as hell. It's a good way to just kind of, you know, it's a real school, but as long as you show up, you'll get your accreditation, right? You go there next to get your master's degree, but again, it's in marketing. And then after that is when he then went to Rushmore. Now the problem with this is that in that specific interview, he claims that the part of the criticism is that the university was not initially accredited when it was founded in 1992, but it later did become accredited. And I think the story he told was, come on, that's like saying you're not born with a driver's license, you know, you got to earn it later. So what's the problem that this school didn't start out accredited? It got its accreditation later. The problem with that is that it wasn't founded in 1992, it was founded in 1996, and to this day has never been accredited by anybody. The next thing is that this, aside from not being accredited and starting 4 years after he said the school started, the university offers online degrees exclusively via distance learning. It has been widely described as a diploma mill, providing illegitimate degrees and diplomas for a fee. So basically, if you're not familiar with the term diploma mill, these are somewhat common, especially these days. You just buy a fake diploma. You don't actually have to do anything. Some of them you just buy a diploma outright fake. Other ones, like this, it's a real school. It's not accredited because it's not actually a real school, but they put up the guise that it's a school. So I went to school there for sure. See, this is a school. They have a mailing address and everything, but they're not accredited. They're not providing any actual education. It's basically, if you pay the fee, they're going to give you a diploma. So that's a diploma mill. And that's how this school has been widely and famously described by just about everybody around the entire world. Again, there's a lot of issues that have happened around the world that came from people claiming specifically to be PhDs from Rushmore University. And then in these foreign countries where they claimed this, it later turned out something bad happened. There was an accident, there was an issue, there was information didn't line up. They dug into it, they discovered this is not a legitimate university, there's no accreditation, your PhD isn't real, and consequences ensued. So it's funny because he claims to have his PhD specifically from Rushmore University, which is not an accredited university. It's been around for less than 30 years. It's not accredited. It never has been. It offers online classes only. It's, let me see, since like 2006, since June 4th of 2006, which is before he went there apparently. This predates his time there. The mailing address has been in the Cayman Islands, and it said specifically, I researched this, in many countries around the world, work done through Rushmore is not acknowledged as PhD work. And Rushmore graduates are not allowed to officially claim a PhD degree. Funny. So I'm not going to dive any more into that. I think you kind of get the idea. The guy goes from a public school, which isn't bad, but it's not a prestigious university. It's just a regular public school, California, public university. Then he downgrades without any official confirmation on whether he actually graduated there or not. He then downgrades to University of Phoenix, which is much easier to kind of fake your way through stuff, but not as easy as Rushmore University, which is a diploma mill. You just pay the money and they give you the diploma, and they are famous for being illegitimate and pumping out fake PhDs. So there's that. It's not internet trolls claiming this stuff. You can look it up yourself. All the information is public information. His PhD is not real. He does not have a real PhD. The school he went to is not accredited. So that aside, there you go. Now, Photoshop is another big thing. People will say, well, if it doesn't work, why does he look so good in his 40s? And it's another thing he pushed in his interview. He kept saying, I made the best results after the age of 40. This actually became kind of a rabbit hole, and it was really, I'm going out of my way to not just sound like I'm hating the guy, because I'm not trying to do that, but if I'm being totally honest, I have a background in photography, and there are certain things that are telltale signs that a photo has been photoshopped. In this case, you don't even have to have a background in photography. You can look at the vast majority of his photos, like all of them that I saw, and see that they have very clearly been photoshopped. They've very clearly been manipulated. Even if somehow there was some sort of disconnect and you were so unfamiliar with the way that a photo is supposed to look if it's real, that you couldn't see the clear indications of absolute, irrefutable Photoshop in his photos, then compare any of his sales photos, his marketing photos of himself and his body, compare any of those to what he looks like in any interview he's ever done. Every single video he's ever done, including his TED Talk, everything, people who have claimed to have met him in real life, his physique in real life in no way resembles the physique of these enhanced photos. So again, that's a very classic marketing thing. If you're selling a supplement, whether it works or not, if you're selling anything, anytime you're selling a gimmick, basically, especially if it's a gimmick, one of the first go-to things for decades now, especially in the magazine industry, was, well, you just Photoshop. It's a common thing, and that's just what he's doing here. I'm gonna skip past the rest of that. Then there's this issue of variable resistance training, because that's the big thing he's selling with his X3, is how effective variable resistance training is. And this is where he gets in the most hot water with basically every single person on the planet who knows what they're talking about. His claims are just not true. Now, again, not everything he says is false. I will give credit where it's due, and I'm gonna get into that. But he says that basically I'm gonna quote him here actually as best as I can. He says that, for example, and he uses the bench press motion as an example, which is very convenient because it's another way to mislead you. I'll explain that in a minute. You know, you're 7 times stronger here than you are here. So basically you're limited, how much you lift is limited by how weak you are in this bottom position. So it allows you to not take advantage of how strong you can be up here and how much more weight you can lift into 7 times ratio, 7 to 1. That's bullshit immediately. I don't know where he got this number. I don't know what weird, maybe Rushmore University study he's claiming, but common sense, just anecdotal evidence, everyday reality can tell you that there's not a 7-fold difference between how much weight you can lift in the bottom versus the top. If that was true, then that means that somebody who's undertrained, is not athletic or strong at all, who can only lift 100 pounds in bench press, can only lift 100 pounds off their chest, because that's how weak they are on the bottom, can actually, at lockout, they can hold 700 pounds. Literally never true, ever. Oftentimes, somebody who can bench press 135 cannot hold 300 pounds at lockout. So the idea that there's a 7-fold advantage, that you can only hold 100 pounds in the bottom, but 700 pounds up here, 7-fold, it's common sense tells you, obviously not, that's not true. It's not just with bench press, any exercise. Think about somebody who can only squat 200 pounds because that's all they can get out of the hole with. It's the hardest in the bottom, right? Or you tell me the person who can only squat 200 pounds would be able to hold 1,400 pounds on their shoulders at lockout? No machines, no gimmicks. It's a free weight barbell and just stand there with 1,400 pounds on their shoulders? No, absolutely not. So immediately the claims start to get dubious. But if we ignore those and we just focus on the idea of variable resistance, because you're weaker at the bottom than you are at the top, this is what we call the strength curve. It's a very common thing that's quoted all the time in fitness and in lifting, and everybody knows about it. It's not a new idea. It's not a secret like he describes it as. It's not, he literally says that through scientific studies, he discovered this thing. Oh man, I just noticed this thing. Everybody knows about that. The strength curve is a well-known phenomenon, and people have been manipulating the way they lift to take advantage of the strength curve for decades, like at least 60 years, but in some cases more than that. But the strength curve is not mysterious. It's not this weird phenomenon, this misunderstood phenomenon through the human body and the mysteries of the muscles. It's just based on basic engineering principles, basic mechanical principles. The same way that we use mechanical principles to decide the safest way to safely design a bridge or anything else. This comes, in this specific case, it comes into the idea of moment arms, or basically lever arms. The longer a moment arm, the more leverage you have against the point of lifting, and the more of an advantage you have. It's like if you take and you try to lift something that's too heavy for you to lift, whatever it is, insert car, whatever. If you try to lift this big, heavy cement stone off the ground and it's like 500 pounds, you can't lift it, right? But if you stick a crowbar under it or a pry bar, if you grab the pry bar right at the front, right by the block, and you push on there, you don't have much of a moment arm. You still can't lift it. But if you get back 3 feet and you press 3 feet away, you created a 3-foot long moment arm, and now suddenly you can easily prop that 500-pound block up off the ground. Moment arms, the idea of leverage, it's not unique to the human body, but it is seen in the human body. It's what we typically refer to as things like biomechanics. I've mentioned it a lot in the past. And in this case, you have something like, again, I'll use his example of the bench press. There's nothing mysterious about it. The idea is that with a normal bench press, gravity is pulling straight down. It's always pulling perpendicular to the line of the horizon. So it doesn't matter where your hand is, perpendicular to the line of the horizon is where gravity pulls. So if my hand is here, whether it's a dumbbell or barbell, doesn't matter. If my hand is here and I have let's say a heavy dumbbell in my hand at lockout, I can hold more weight at lockout because gravity is pulling straight down below the weight, which is through my locked out arms, shoulders, everything else. So it's supported the same way that a pillar supports the roof of a building, right? However, if I move my hand out a few inches, 6 inches to a foot to the left, 15 to 30 centimeters to the right, I mean, then what happened is from right to left, I've now created a short moment arm. The moment arm is as long as the straight perpendicular line below the barbell to the point of origin of force exertion, which is my shoulder. So it's a short moment arm, but it means now I can't hold as much weight here because there's a moment arm acting against this point of rotation, which is being controlled by my pec in this case. As my hand goes lower and my hand gets further away from my shoulder, that moment arm gets longer and longer and longer. So where, yeah, down here, it's much, much more difficult to hold weight. I cannot hold as much weight here in the bottom as I can at the top. But there are some built-in caveats with this. So for example, the muscle is not this perpetual motion device. It's not this infinite thing where if it can lift it forever. It's not like you find a weight that you can do for a 1 rep max, and because your muscles are capable of lifting it that one time, now you can just continue to lift it forever. Whether it's how many total reps you can do or how long that rep takes, as we know, it's harder to do a very slow controlled rep than it is to do a fast rep. The muscle is firing. It's firing these motor neurons and contracting the muscle through various means, depending on the type of muscle fiber, whether it's fast twitch, A or B, or to slow twitch, depending on the size of the motor neuron size, its fuel source, whether it's glucose or triglycerides, what its oxidative capacity is, what its force output is. The types of muscle fibers determine what you can do with those muscle fibers. And even in the case where you're using a muscle fiber that's specifically meant for lifting heavy weight, it's got a gas tank on it. It can only perform as long as that gas tank is there. Once you deplete it, it can't perform anymore. So the idea that if you can lift it here, you can lock it out, no problem, because we all know it's harder down here. Anybody who's ever actually worked out, who's ever been to a gym, who's ever exercised, knows immediately, no. When you fail a rep, like you're saying, I'm gonna do a set of 8 reps on bench press, for example. 6 reps, oh, it's getting really tough. I don't know if I can make it to 8. And then you go to 7, getting out of the bottom is no problem. It's getting it halfway up and then, trying to lock it out. That's the problem. But why is that a problem? Jaquish says that this is the toughest part. And if I get halfway up, I've got like a 3.5 time power increase. If I get to the top, I'm 7 times stronger here. So why is it that the reps most commonly fail right before lockout when I'm in a much more advantageous position mechanically? Well, it's because you're burning through the stores. There's a few things. Well, one, there's the elastic rebound, which he mentions in weird terms and kind of misquotes the significance of before, but there's the elastic rebound effect, which is the stored energy of your muscles. Yes, the muscles are mechanically disadvantageous in its lower position, right? Because there's a lever arm being created. But because it has stored elastic energy in the muscles, that helps your body overcome and make up the difference of that stretch of the moment arm. Which is also why, again, trying to pause the weight on your chest and do a paused bench press is much more difficult than doing a touch and go. Because a paused bench press means that you're starting to leak out and lose the elastic rebound effect. It's losing that stored energy. Whereas touch and go, like a rubber band, it's much easier to snap back. So yes, there is a inherent built-in mechanical disadvantage because a lever arm has been created, but because of the stored energy of the elastic rebound of muscles, it overcomes that disadvantage. Not only that, but when you start the rep, like at the bottom, this is when you potentially have the most energy. Not only do you have elastic rebound potential, but also the muscle hasn't been destroyed yet. It still has a full gas tank to go ahead and try to force through it. But the higher you go, not only is there less and less elastic rebound to take advantage of, so more and more of the weight is being pushed raw through your real muscles, but if you go halfway up, you've theoretically burned halfway through your energy stores. This is why when you're nearing the end of the final rep, you don't know if you can lock it out or not. despite the mechanically advantageous position, you might have burned through all the glucose in that muscle. You might be depleted of ATP by this point. The oxidative capacity has been diminished or depleted. So the idea that you need to use something like, let's say, resistance bands because they're lighter at the bottom and heavier at the top, and that's how your body works, is immediately misleading. In theory, if we didn't have things like limited gas tanks due to energy stores and everything else, if we didn't have to worry about the oxidative capacity or the force output of various muscle fiber types or the energy stores, if we didn't have things like elastic rebound through stored energy, all these various things, then maybe that would hold water. But in the real world, with all of the actual facts and figures and just real world experience at our disposal, you can either read this stuff factually in actual scientific studies, or you can just go to a gym and try it yourself. You never fail on the bottom. Unless you tried some weight that you had no business trying, you're like, I don't know if I'll get this, and it comes down and fails. Aside from something like that, if you're doing multiple reps of a weight, you never end up failing it in the bottom. You'll fail it halfway up, or you'll fail just before lockout, despite the fact that you're supposedly 7 times stronger there. So immediately, that just debunks everything he's saying about you have to be heavier at the top. That's not true, because when you have the same weight at the top that you have at the bottom, you still usually will get it out of the bottom no problem, where you're supposed to be weak, and you will fail it at the top where you're supposed to be strong. So put a pin in that, and let's move to the next thing. The next point is that he's not using some futuristic scientific way of matching the strength curve. It's a one-size-fits-all resistance band. I think the primary one he sells is like 41 inches. I'm assuming he sells them in other sizes, but he doesn't take into account someone's limb length, their specific anthropology, their biomechanics, their range of motion, everything else. So if you don't know if you're selling this to a person who's 5'2" and has proportionately short arms versus someone who's 6'8" and has proportionately long arms, the way that resistance band is going to react, the way that it's going to provide resistance, and the way it's going to multiply that resistance through the range of motion is going to be vastly, completely different. I could go into this further, but I've already been talking too much. Basically, this means no. You're not matching your strength curve just because you're using a resistance band. You're not matching anything. I have a hard time moving on because there's too many examples of this, but we'll move on. The other thing is, again, these resistance bands, they're common. These things have been around literally for decades. Back when I was in high school, when I was a kid, when I was 16 years old, and I'd already been training for a few years, but I had first gotten into powerlifting, these were already a staple by powerlifters. Powerlifters already used these and chains and things like that, which he does mention, but again, he mentions it in kind of dubious ways. It's not just powerlifters that use these. You see resistance bands being used for decades with all sorts of people, and whether it's training, like weight training, or it's rehab, or it's flexibility, whether it's this or it's that, it's about travel gyms. You'll see soldiers take this stuff on the road with them. Like, resistance bands have been around and used for a very, very, very long time. But even if we just focus on the powerlifting aspect, he talks about, well, look at Westside Barbell. They broke over 200 records, and it's because they use these. Again, you're playing off the people who don't know what they're talking about, because I was a powerlifter. I was a competitive powerlifter. I met Westside guys. I met Louis Simmons. I've talked to all those people. I've been around their training. I've tried their training. I've been in the gym. I've trained alongside some legends that came out of that gym. And what I know from experience is that, well, one, maybe the average person doesn't know it, but Westside Barbell was all about equipped lifting, which means they use bench press certs, squat suits, things like that. It's not raw lifting. There's a difference between what you do on the platform and what you do in the gym, which he mentions, but again, he mentions it in the wrong way and in a misleading way. In the gym, the reason why they use resistance bands is because when you use a bench press shirt, the bench press shirt binds up and it prevents you from pulling your arms back. It physically stops you. It requires hundreds and hundreds of pounds of weight to force your arms down low enough that you can touch your chest. So when you go to push, it almost jumps up by itself. But the higher the bar goes, the less assistance the shirt is offering, and the more and more of the weight you have to do by yourself until finally you lock it out. You basically have to lock it out on your own. So how does somebody who competes exclusively with a bench press shirt train their bench press to be the strongest at the lockout specifically, without having to always squeeze into a shirt, which wears the shirts out, it's dangerous, all these other things? Oh, we'll use things like chains and resistance bands because it gives a disproportionately heavier weight at the top, which mimics our bench press shirts. But famously, those guys are not very strong when it comes to raw power. All the guys at a West Side, who are strong guys, I'm not saying they're weak, they are notably strong guys, but the guys at West Side, with very, very few exceptions, like I could probably, with all the hundreds of athletes who've gone through West Side, I could probably count the number of exceptions on one hand. Those guys only set records in equipped lifting, so squat suits, bench shirts, all that stuff, in their own federations, in their own very poorly judged federations. So they'll squat down and they'll literally do a half squat. And powerlifting, you're supposed to squat to parallel and then come up. And there's a million videos of them on YouTube, you can check it yourself. The guys at a West Side were notorious for the fact that they would squat down like 3 inches and they couldn't go any lower because their suit was too stiff. And they'd stand up and they'd get all 3 white lights. Yeah, you broke the record, good job. That's why West Side became a joke over the years, because the squats got higher and higher, the benches got more and more ridiculous, no pausing, not quite touching, all this stuff, didn't quite lock it out, just stopped moving, but like, oh no, it's locked out, and they grab it and pull it off of him. Oh, he set a record. So there's that. But then the guys, once they took their bench press shirts off, once they took their squat suits off, they couldn't lift a fraction of what they were lifting with the suits on. They never set any raw records, again, with very, very few exceptions. There are a few notable exceptions, but it's unbelievably rare. So if the idea of using resistance bands was universally so superior, then why are you only using the example of guys who are not strong, notably strong raw, only compete with equipment on, and even then only use bands selectively here and there? It's not the only thing they train on. They actually train primarily with just free weight, and then they'll use chains and everything else. So there's that. The next thing I was going to say on that note before I forget is that he selectively only talks about bench press as an example. He'll say, well, you know, you're stronger here because it's locked out, and here, mechanical disadvantage. That's true. Here's the problem though. This only applies to the pushing motions of your body. Let me grab my other resistance band here. If I want to sell this product, then I say, oh, look at that. Hey, look at this, I just made my own X3. Yeah, right here, the resistance band isn't stretched out. Not much resistance, right? It's very minimal resistance. And this is also where I'm weakest because of, you know, strength curve stuff. But I push it to the top and look at that. It's providing more resistance at the top, and that's also where I'm strongest. This is amazing. So this is a superior way to train. But what about the non-push movements? What about every single movement in your body that requires that the contracted position of the muscle is actually when you are at the highest mechanical disadvantage? A great example is the exact opposite of bench press. If you're doing a rowing motion. Now, in a rowing motion, you are actually the strongest at the bottom, which is here. When the weight is pulling your back, stretching it out. This is where you're at a mechanical advantage, because again, there's not much of a moment arm working against your lats and your rear delt. But the higher you go and the closer you get to lockout, the more of a moment arm is being created that's working against your back muscles, working against your lats, your rhomboids, your teres, your rear delt, your supraspinatus, all these things. So that means that you're actually the weakest at lockout and you're the strongest at the bottom. But if I try to use my X3 here and I say, okay, resistance band. Well, this is the bottom position where I'm strongest, and that's also where the resistance band is the loosest and providing the least amount of resistance where I'm strongest. And then at the top, oh, I'm pulling myself forward. At the top, where the resistance band is providing the most resistance, is actually where I'm the absolute weakest because there's a mechanical disadvantage being created by the moment arm. So that means if theoretically, going off of his claims, using a resistance band, using his X3, because of the strength curve stuff, it's 3 times more effective than traditional weight training to do a banded bench press rather than a free weight bench press, then that means by that same metric, it would be 3 times worse to do a rowing motion with the band than it is with free weights. Actually, free weights would be 3 times more effective than a band for the exact same reason. And this isn't just the rowing movement. You might say, oh, I never do rows. What about curls? Because tricep extensions is the same thing. Here, when you're at a mechanical disadvantage, that's when the tricep is fully extended. That's the bottom of the position. As you extend it closer and closer to lockout, it's becoming a more advantageous position. Great for your resistance bands. But what about when you're curling? Because when you curl, the bottom of the position, where you're at the mechanically advantageous position, the strongest position, is the bottom, where you're not getting any resistance from the band, or minimal resistance. At the very top, where you have the top of the motion, where you're the weakest, you're contracting the tightest, but you are the weakest because there's a moment arm being created between the resistance here and your elbow, which is the point of rotation. That's where the largest moment arm is. That's where you're the weakest, but yet that's where the band is the stretched out the most and it's providing the most resistance. Again, so it's actually flipping around and it's providing the exact opposite stimulus of what you would need if you wanted to match your strength curve. It's giving you no resistance or minimal resistance where you're strongest and maximal resistance where you're weakest. So that's the other thing he very conveniently doesn't talk about. He will point out things like bench press over and over again. Look at how the strength curve works, perfect for a band. But he never talks about curls or rows for the exact same reason. Because in this case, it would be worse to use a resistance band or to use the X3. Is variable resistance actually good or is it superior? Yes, it is effective. Yeah, it's effective. But no, it's not superior to traditional training. Despite Jaquish's cherry-picked very specific studies and misquoting very limited information from those studies, the actual science does not support his claims. In the Journal of Science and Medicine in Sport, 17 different studies were analyzed, and it was consistently found that in terms of maximal muscle strength, there were no statistically significant differences between variable resistance training and traditional resistance training for the lower or the upper body. Additionally, there were no significant training-related differences in muscle power for the lower or the upper body. Subgroup analysis showed a significant moderator effect for training period and repetitions per set for maximal muscle strength in the lower body, with larger strength following traditional resistance training when performed with more repetitions per set. So concluding, variable resistance training and traditional resistance training are equally effective in healthy adults. But you need to note, the more reps that are performed, the more effective traditional training becomes. And again, you could go into this for many reasons, but it's a whole different story. Then we look at volume, things like volume and frequency. A natural athlete absolutely sees better results with training more frequently. And the fact that people still argue this is baffling to me, because every example you see, if you look at old, ancient writings of people training like literally thousands of years ago, scripts that they've written like back in Greek times or anything else, those athletes trained. They actually specifically trained for various purposes and activities, and it was never a less frequent thing. What human beings in every single culture around the world that were training for every single purpose all unanimously found was they saw a better result. It was more effective when they trained more frequently. If you then look at sport-specific stuff, just in the past 150 years, since the modern fitness revolution of gyms and barbells and things like that, okay, all the old school silver era bodybuilders and before steroids were a thing, they all trained their body, either full body, 3-4 days a week, or upper lower, again, multiple times a week. But they trained their muscles on average 3 times a week, saw great results. And that was with primitive workouts, no real scientific knowledge, primitive diet ideas and concepts, no drugs, no supplements, no nothing. Just picking up some old school barbells and training their full body 3 times a week, and they saw great results. That carries on over into when you start getting into sport-specific stuff, whether it's 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and on. Whether it's bodybuilding or powerlifting or strongman, you see the same thing. The best athletes get the best results training each muscle multiple times a week. That's what's seen the vast majority of the time. In fact, the only time you ever see less frequent training being superior, or not even in this case superior, just really, really effective, is when they're taking steroids. They're on some kind of drugs, because being on steroids, among many, many other things, it extends the window for muscle protein synthesis. When you're natural, that window lasts like 72 hours at best. But the more advanced you become, the better your body is at recovering more quickly, so it might be closed sooner than that. So anecdotally, if you just look at athletes, again, basketball players, football players, tennis players, swimmers, bodybuilders, powerlifters, strongmen, all the best train each movement pattern or each muscle multiple times a week in order to maximize their results. That's just how it is. And this is not even seen anecdotally, it's also seen scientifically. Because whether we're looking at something like, again, muscle protein synthesis, which shows us pretty clearly that you should be training more than once a week, or you look at something like the repeated bow effect, which shows us pretty clearly that the more often you train, the more efficient your body becomes, and the more often you're able to train. But then there's also just the neurological adaptations. Some of these movement patterns, especially when you look at something like, let's say, Olympic weightlifting, that absolutely requires strength, but it also very specifically requires very fine-tuned movement patterns. And the only way you can fine-tune these movement patterns and keep them working as flawlessly and optimally as possible is to do them all the time. That's why, again, for many, many decades now, every single weightlifting team, every single national weightlifting team from every single country, from every single era, all around the world has one thing in common. They do things like the clean and press, the snatch, the jerk, all these things. They do those movements all the time, multiple times a week, sometimes every day. In the case of people like the Bulgarian team, they notoriously trained everything twice a day, every day. Frequency is your friend and volume is king, and that is scientifically backed. So his idea that training once a week is better, it's not detrimental, but time and time again, through my personal experiences, through the experiences of anybody I've ever trained personally, anybody I've ever known, any examples I've ever seen from reading through history, from reading modern scientific literature, it all agrees that no, training once a week for each given muscle is not optimal. It could be effective, but it's not optimal. And then past that, you have the fact that he will sometimes claim, well, yeah, resistance bands, they existed before, but nobody ever had his concept, his idea of really maximizing the use of the resistance bands in terms of the strength curve and being a dedicated gym that focuses only on resistance bands. Because apparently, when a powerlifter, as an example, because again, a lot of people do this, but when a powerlifter takes a resistance band and he loops it over a bar and he performs a bench press motion with a resistance band and a barbell, that's totally different than Jaquish deciding that he's going to take the exact same resistance band and instead of putting it over something stupid like a barbell, he's going to cut the middle section out of that barbell. So it's a barbell handle and loop the band over that. Now he's an inventor. Now he's got all the patents, guys. This guy has thought of something brand new nobody ever figured out before. Fine, fair enough. But even if I've given that credit, fine, you're an inventor, you figured this out. That doesn't mean that the X3 is the only system that utilizes variable resistance. The Bowflex is a very common example of a machine that does not use any plate weight. It doesn't use any traditional methods. It uses resistance bands. It has like bow rods, whatever they call them, bow rods, whatever it is. They're these big things that work just like resistance bands. It provides variable resistance. The less bent they are, the less resistance they provide. And the harder you try to go and the more you bend them, the more they resist being bent and the more resistance there is. So once again, it's variable resistance through their rods. But then you have something like the Solo Flex. I think the Solo Flex was out before the Bowflex ever was. And the Solo Flex, ironically enough, was a machine that again used just resistance bands. Very similar to these, except instead of really long resistance bands, it used these little short mini resistance bands that were very, very thick, very stout. They came in different weight categories, but you would hook this little resistance band to the machine, and then you go through your motions of whether it was squat, overhead press, anything basically. But the resistance came from stretching the resistance band. So again, it was variable resistance through a type of resistance band. You'll see some of these pneumatic machines where they use like an air piston, a pneumatic piston to provide resistance. And again, depending on what machine it is and how it's designed and how it works, many of those provide variable resistance throughout the range of motion. And aside from resistance bands or chains or the Bowflex or the Solo Flex or pneumatic machines or anything else, is the fact that even with traditional gym machines, plate-loaded stuff, plate-loaded, pin-loaded, whatever, machines for a very long time have, on a pretty regular and standard basis, always taken advantage of the resistance curve, of the strength curve. One of the most notable, like kind of first times this happened widespread was Nautilus. Now Nautilus, Arthur Jones with his Nautilus machines was not the first person to do this. That you should see examples of like old Victorian era, like mid and late 1800s, and some of those original primitive gyms where people worked out wearing their full like suits and get up, like, oh, we're being healthy, right? You'll see big cams on those machines that are changing the moment arm, that are changing the amount of resistance through the range of motion. It wasn't a standardized thing. Arthur Jones was the first one to really, with intent and with focus and with purpose, make a standard thing across all his machines. The way that the machine moved is supposed to match your movement pattern, and the way that the cam is shaped is supposed to match your strength curve so that you are maximizing the potential of your muscle through the entire range of motion. So again, even with traditional weights or just machines at the gym, you can do this, because even today with just random machines by some made in China company, not Nautilus, they very frequently have these cams that are misshapen, because depending on where you're at in the range of motion, it'll provide a different amount of resistance. So that's the other thing. And then, of course, as I started studying this guy and reading into him, I saw that apparently he has a lot of criticism, not on the fact that he has a fake PhD, the fact that apparently the customer service is atrocious. I was reading that there have been widespread issues with people receiving their X3 and one of the bands is damaged, and then when they try to call to say, hey, this band is damaged, the company more or less says, hey, go fuck yourself. It's probably your fault. If people mention any problems they're having or question any of the methodologies or basically say anything other than kissing his ass in the Facebook group, they'll get booted out of the group immediately. Apparently, it's very much you have to buy my machine, my entire machine, only my machine, train only with my machine, and follow only my workout, and then tell everybody how great it is. If you miss and match anything, if you deviate from my workout, and if you don't profess that this is the best thing ever, then immediately you're silenced, you're being kicked out of the group, it's whatever. It's a very dogmatic, cult-like behavior from the guy. So that's the other thing. Yeah, in summary, and I'm gonna actually just read this word for word because this is a good summary. I have no doubt that the X3 is a very well-made piece of equipment, and I agree that you can achieve results using it, even if you use it exclusively. However, John Jaquish is wrong about the overwhelming majority of his claims. This is a guy that is good at business and good at marketing. He attended one legitimate university in the 90s, and since then has attained his master's and then his PhD from progressively more suspicious universities. With the PhD coming from an online-only school based in the Cayman Islands that has absolutely no accreditation. He spent most of his time studying marketing, then went on to market his X3 device and training by the most well-known and famously unethical ways possible, by making outrageous claims that every other training method or device is a waste of time, that nobody in the world outside of a very few genetic phenoms are fit. And those few genetic phenoms that are fit are not to be given credit, as it occurs naturally for them and is not a result of anything they have done. He tells desperate, gullible, naive people that the entire world and all of history and science has lied to them, that reality itself is a conspiracy to keep you down and prevent you from having the body you want. But he and he alone is the real science and the truth about all the secrets the world is keeping from you, that he alone is able to save you. And if you just provide him with your credit card number, your dreams will come true. Now, off the cuff, no notes, I'm going to say the idea of using resistance band isn't bad. They work. That's why I have them. That's why so many people own them and have used them for decades. The idea of using resistance bands along with a bar is fine. As a matter of fact, this is something you can buy here in Asia. These are cheap. These are like less than $10, but these are the little travel gyms. I have way more bands over there in different colors, but every color is a different resistance level, and they each have their own little clip. And this is a single one-handed handle, so it's like isolateral training. And again, by stepping on one side, the other one up, you can do overhead extensions, you can do shoulder press, you can do curls, put around your back, do bench press. You can basically work your entire body with this, and it doesn't require the super fancy barbell, it doesn't require the base plate. But despite that, I'm not criticizing the fact that he sells those things because they do look like they're good quality. But this thing where he's super loud, he's super arrogant, he talks to people like they're stupid, he makes the most outrageous claims that quite literally weightlifting is a waste of time. It doesn't work for anybody. Nobody ever sees results. There's like 1,000 people worldwide, population of close to 8 billion people. I think it passed 8 billion now, but a global population of around 8 billion people. And there's like 1,000 fit people in the world. And it just happens genetically. They didn't even try for it. And that everybody else in the world who does traditional training sees no results. This doesn't work. And that the only way to see results is with his special bar and band system. And through that, you're going to see results 3 times faster, and you're never going to stop hitting PRs, and you're going to lose weight, and you're going to do this and all these. It's a charlatan. It's a classic textbook case of a snake oil salesman. The fact that he works so hard to silence people that criticize his products, the fact that he works so hard to not answer questions directly, but instead just kind of have smart-ass answers or to deviate around them, is classic con man stuff. Literally con man stuff. Con man coming from the term confidence man. You just act confident and you act like what everything you're saying obviously it's true. I'm saying, why would I say if it wasn't true? And you get people to believe, and you're like, yeah, it's true, man. He must be right because he seems like he knows what he's talking about. That's how this guy is. Even when you say directly, hey, what about the fact that people have pointed out that your PhD isn't real? And then it came from a non-accredited school. He said, oh, come on. I mean, that's just internet trolls saying stuff. I mean, not every school is accredited when it starts and da-da-da-da-da, blah, 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 and those just, he never talks about the fact that the school's still not accredited. In fact, he lies and says that it now is accredited when it's not. He doesn't address the fact that this accreditation, not only does it not exist, but having a PhD or any degree from this school is not recognized anywhere in the world, not just in the States, anywhere in the world. You can read stories, specific cases that have been documented in countries all throughout Europe and Asia where somebody showing up with a PhD from Rushmore University was later, it caused a lot of problem because they were making claims and as an authority figure because they had a PhD, which then later had to be redacted and fixed and basically like public apologies and everything else because it turned out it was all bullshit and they didn't realize at first that, oh, this guy isn't a real PhD. He's not a real doctor. He doesn't know what he's talking about. If you have the X3 and you like it, I'm not arguing with you. It looks like a good piece of equipment. If you say it's high quality, I believe you. If you say that you get great workouts, I believe you. Resistance bands do provide a good workout. If you say it's the only thing you use and you get results, I believe you. Everything else is horseshit. This idea that only one set for the muscle once a week, the only using resistance bands and it's 3 times more effective than traditional training, which is, again, kind of gets into funny things because on the one hand, he'll say, You'll build muscle 3 times faster, which is why it's called the X3. But and then the next sentence he says, by the way, traditional weight training is not effective at all. It's completely ineffective. You get 0 results. So you're telling me that if I use your band system, I'm gonna get 0 results 3 times faster? So I'll achieve 0 results even faster than before? Awesome, great, sign me up. Like, most of what this guy is saying, you don't have to read the scientific studies. You don't have to be familiar with the literature. You don't have to even read between the lines. If you step back and just think about some of the stuff he's saying, common sense will tell you he's full of shit. I thought maybe the guy, he's nice and just doesn't know better. But then the more I read, the more I saw, the more interviews I watched, the more I was convinced he's not a nice guy. He's fucking sleazy. He's a charlatan. He's preying on naive people, as most con men do. He smiles, he promises you the world, he tells you everything wrong is not your fault, it's the world's fault, but I'm here to save you, just buy my product, which is also very overpriced. But don't worry, buy my product, buy my system, buy me, and all your problems will be solved. That's classic con man shit. End of story. So, I hope that if you have the product, the X3, that you like it, that you're getting good use out of it. Again, I have no doubt that it works well. But forget the guy who sold it to you. Forget his outrageous claims. He's full of shit. All right.